What's up, you guys? My name is Robbie. I'm a strength and conditioning coach and I'm a student physical therapist. And today we're going to talk about hip pain while you're sitting on your surfboard. So we're going to talk about some reasons why you may have hip pain while you're sitting on your surfboard. Number one is a lack of hip mobility. Lack of hip mobility is when you don't have the range of motion to be sitting with your knee kind of raised above your hip line, your leg kind of rotated out and to the side. If you don't have that range of motion to be sitting in that position for long periods of time, then you're probably aggravating certain tissues. So a fix to that is improving hip mobility. So what causes your hip mobility to be lacking? Well, it's like your lifestyle factors. We're sitting in chairs most of the day in our cars, and your hips aren't really getting past 90 degrees. So tight muscles, other tight tissues like your hip joint capsule, which is like a fibrous capsule around your joint, that tends to get stiff, and weak muscles as well. When we have weaknesses, our body tends to get tight. So loosening the tight muscles and strengthening the weak muscles is going to be our fix for that one. Another issue that causes painful hips is your genetic hip structure, and there's not much you can do about that. You're kind of born with it. So if you go to see a PT or you do all these movements and nothing helps, could just be that your hips just aren't built to be in that range of motion. One thing you can do is sit with the tip of your board pointing down in the water. That way your knees aren't up so high and you're not forced into that range of motion that's tough to get to. And the last one here that tends to cause hip pain for people is hip impingement. And it's kind of a buzzword. I'm sure we've all heard this, or you may not have, but it can be caused by a couple different things. I think more commonly than not, this occurs when you have an imbalance of forces on your femur. And so it pulls the ball, which is the head of the femur, forward in the socket. So it just puts an uneven amount of pressure into the socket of that hip joint. So if you can imagine, you have a lot of tight muscles kind of on this anterior portion of your femur, and it's kind of pulling that head of the femur more towards the front. So that, again, that tight musculature and weak musculature in the back, not able to pull it, not centering it in the socket, is what can cause some hip impingement type symptoms. True medically diagnosed hip impingement is when you actually have bone spurs growing on different parts of your femur and hip socket, and that's when bone-on-bone action happens, and that you definitely want to get checked out by a doctor. But those are kind of the main causes of hip pain. So we're going to focus on kind of this section right here, working on hip mobility and balancing out the forces that act on that ball and socket joint. So the head of your femur is more centered in your joint, so it's not kind of putting pressure on one part and causing aggravation of those tissues. All right, so let's go ahead and work on our stretches. So again, we're gonna stretch the tight muscles that can limit our range of motion, as well as pull the head of the femur into an improper alignment in that hip socket. So the first stretch that we're gonna do is an adductor stretch, so inner thigh stretch. So you're gonna put your hands down, kick one leg out to the side, make sure you have a neutral spine, flat back. You're just gonna rock back to your heel. Forward and back. And if that feels all right, you can go ahead and open up a little bit wider and continue to get that stretch. If you're not feeling a stretch on this one, it's likely that you're rounding your back, right? So you're kind of getting your back in this position. So make sure you're really extending back nice and flat, and you should feel a pretty good stretch there. So the next stretch that we're gonna do is a figure 4 and a TFL stretch. So what you're gonna do, lay on your back, one knee bent, ankle on the other thigh, lift the foot off the ground, and use your hands to help push that right leg, or that leg that's up, into external rotation. Should get a pretty good stretch on the back of the hip. You're gonna hold that for about 30 seconds. Then you're gonna put that foot down and rotate your hips to the side, and you should get a pretty good stretch at the front of your hip. That's your TFL. It attaches to your IT band, which can cause IT band syndrome. This muscle is usually involved in that. All right, so the next stretch that we're gonna work on is a hip flexor stretch. So we're sitting a lot of the time, so the hip flexors tend to get tight. So the way that you want to stretch them is getting into this half kneeling position. And you don't need to do this weird thing to stretch your hip flexors. That's probably gonna cause you more damage than good. All you need to do is know how to posteriorly tilt your pelvis. It's kind of a hard one. Take some time to get the hang of, so don't worry if you don't get it right off the bat. So you wanna go from this position where your hip flexors on slack to a posteriorly tilted position where you're actually stretching it by doing that tilt motion. You make sure to squeeze that glute. And once you lock in a good stretch here, what you can do is just lean away from that hip. And that's deepening that stretch. You should feel it kind of coming up higher up your hip. So another good stretch you can do to really help stretch your quads. Also helps in flexing your hip. It's also a hip flexor, but this is a little bit more targeted for your quads, because you are flexing your knee and using something to kind of help hold your foot up there. And you're getting back into this half kneeling position. So start off slow, make sure you have enough stability here. And you're just gonna slowly straighten your torso. Again, as you go into that posterior tilt, squeezing that glute, you should feel, this isn't a very good thing, but you get the idea of something assisting keeping your foot up. Again, going into that posterior tilt, you should get a pretty deep stretch on your quad for this one. All right, so we worked on stretching some tight muscles that can limit your range of motion and also contribute to the head of your femur not moving properly in the socket. So now we're gonna actually do some manipulations of the joint itself to help center that femur so it's moving well in the motions that we wanna work in. So you're gonna grab a band, just like this, nice thick band, so it has good resistance. You're gonna go ahead, put your leg through it, and kind of bring it up to your hip crease so it's pretty high up. So you're trying to get as close to the neck of the femur as possible. You're gonna make sure the band's getting stretched behind you from a posterior direction, and you're just gonna kind of crawl forward, make sure it's positioned in a comfortable spot so you get some pretty good tension on the band. And from here, go knees about and feet about shoulder width apart. I'm just gonna go into that hip flexion squat type position that you kind of are in when you're sitting on a surfboard. So you're just gonna rock in and out of that for about 20 times. What this is doing is kind of retraining your joint to work properly. All right, so we worked on loosening up the hip, kind of getting that joint positioned better than it was before. So now we're going to work on some strengthening exercises, right? You don't want to do the stretching and the joint mobilizations without the strengthening component, because that's what's going to help keep that range of motion. That's what's going to improve stability of your hip, and that's what's going to help balance the forces that are exerted on your femur so that ball is centered in that joint socket properly. So the first movement that we're gonna do is a banded clamshell. It's gonna kind of like the rotator cuff in your shoulder. It's gonna help strengthen your external rotators. So what you're gonna need is just a simple band. You're gonna go ahead, put the band around the knees, just like so, right above the kneecaps. You're gonna lay on your side, It's not a very exciting exercise, but it is effective in strengthening those external rotators. You're just gonna go ahead and open up your knees. Hip and knees are bent at about a 45-degree angle, feet together. And you're just gonna open up, making sure not to open up towards the ceiling. Keep your body angled towards the ground. Gonna open up and hold for about 30 seconds or as long as you can. All right, we're just holding that. And you're gonna switch sides. While you got this band on, we're gonna move into a different stability exercise that also helps with the external rotators and your hip abductors, just working on those hip stability muscles. You're gonna start in this quadruped position on the hands and knees. Then you're just going to extend back slightly and rotate out. We're just gonna hold that again for 30 seconds, making sure the spine is in a neutral position, right? No rounding or overextending. Just holding that. You should feel that standing hip, those muscles on that side glute working to stabilize. You're gonna do 30 seconds and repeat on the other side. And the next in this banded hip complex is you land your back. Lower back flat on the ground, core engaged. Feet shoulder width apart, stretch that band. You're just bringing your hips up into the air, squeezing your butt. Up and down for about 15 reps. Make sure you have a challenging band. This one's a bit easy for me. So, core exercise as well as a hip flexor exercise. Just gonna hands and feet in the air, band around the feet. This is gonna work on strengthening those hip flexors. Again, sometimes when muscles are weak, they tend to tighten up to create artificial stability. So, you're gonna kick one leg out as this hip flexor is working to keep this knee flexed. Bring it back and alternate. Remember, you wanna keep that lower back nice and flat, pressed against the ground, so your core is working in conjunction with your hip flexor. And if you feel like it's coming up, right, like my back is arching right now, make sure to kick a little higher. It's gonna make it a little easier on the core. All right, so the last movement, they're called airplanes. So you're essentially gonna, again, work on some of those hip stability muscles, those rotators and abductors, as well as help kind of center the ball in the socket again with this motion. So you're gonna get into that single leg, a single leg RDL position. So on one leg, soft knee, right? You're gonna hinge your hips. I have a wall behind me, so not much space, but once you get into this single leg RDL position, all you're gonna do, and you can use this beside some, like a pole or a table to help stabilize. I'll show you from the side. In that single leg RDL position, you're just going to open up and close. And again, you can use an arm to help stabilize. You're gonna open up as far as you feel comfortable and close. You should really feel this hip muscle working. You're gonna open up and close, trying to get a set of 10. All right, you guys, so just as a quick recap, today we went over how to stretch some tight muscles as well as mobilize your hip joint so we can help center that ball in the socket so it moves and functions better. Again, a reason why those muscles may be tight is you might be lacking stability. So weaknesses that we worked on, your body tends to create that stiffness and tightness to create stability where your muscles can't provide it. So really working on that strengthening component, like we talked about and went over, is really gonna help open up the hips. Doing the stretches that we went through, the strengthening movements is really gonna help on that. And you can use that as a warm-up to any of your workouts that you're gonna do, especially when you're going to surf. That's a great warm-up to do beforehand. So I hope these movements help you out. I hope it decreases your hip pain with surfing and helps you surf better. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below of how it helped you or what else you need help with when it comes to surfing and pain. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video.